Welcome to Culture Wars Radio. I'm your host, David Wemhoff, and with us is Dr. E. Michael Jones, the publisher and editor of Culture Wars magazine. During Culture Wars Radio, you're going to get a front row seat at the culture wars that are raging in this country and around the world. Dr. Jones is the author of more than about 13 books that have to deal with issues of culture. You can find out more about these books by going to his website at culturewars.com. Now, we left off the other day. We were talking about the president and the compromise it looks like he may be reaching with the Republicans on a tax plan which affects certain tax cuts. Yay, everybody likes that. That's a great idea, isn't it? Tax cuts, everybody wants tax cuts. Well, when you look at this tax plan, if you read closely the news articles that are out there, they talk about, as part of the tax cut, if not the entire tax cut, cutting Social Security taxes. Well, what does that mean? Well, obviously that means that then you're not going to be paying as much money into Social Security, which is already overburdened. So I guess the question is, do people really know what's going on, or is this just bread and circuses? Mike, do people know what's going on?
Well, I think they should read what the people who are working at the think tanks are writing. Because
what are they saying?
They're the people who are behind this thing, these conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation or the American Enterprise Institute, who are paid to promote the goals of capitalism. David John wrote an article in it was syndicated all over the place, but he's with the Heritage Foundation, and it was all about reform. You know, we have to reform Social Security. It's kind of old. It's 75 years old. It's starting to show its age. That's the way he begins. And it would be better. He just wants to make it better. That's the impression he gives in this article.
And what's wrong with that?
Nothing's wrong with that, but the question is what he's proposing going to make it better? That's the big question. So let's cut to the chase here. One of his recommendations is eligibility should be increased to age 68 by 2023 for full benefits and to age 65 for early retirement. But it's not a step that I recommend lightly. So even he's scared by what he just said there, okay? Now, if we think about it, what is he proposing here? Keeping people in the workforce, let's say, for another 5 years? Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that younger workers can't get jobs. The whole point of Social Security was to phase people out of the workforce so that you open up spaces for newer, younger workers.
Well, now, wait a minute. Hold on. There wasn't a Social Security also to take care of workers who have been working all their life?
Oh, obviously, that's the purpose the main purpose is to provide a stable pension fund for people who live in an economy where they're constantly being cheated out of a wage and a pension. So, yes, obviously that. But one of the side benefits, collateral benefits of this was that it got people out of the workforce, and that allowed new people to come into the workforce. This is crucial to the whole concept of Social Security because those people then start paying into the system. Okay, if you keep these people on longer, okay, you're preventing new people from coming into the system. You're preventing family formation. There are all sorts of bad effects that come from this type of postponement.
I guess there's got to be more jobs created somehow. And did Mr. Johns and the AEI, American Enterprise Institute, come up with a plan for that?
Mr. John works for the Heritage Foundation.
Oh, Heritage Foundation.
But no, there's no plan here. He's just concentrating on basically cutting Social Security without telling anyone the full ramifications of what would happen if you cut back on Social Security. That's the problem. Okay, as I said before, if you're talking about $4 trillion in lost revenue over the next 10 years, which would be what the net result of this tax cut, there's only one thing on the horizon that can solve the problem if you frame it that way, and that's abolishing Social Security and Medicare. It's the only thing that's going to solve that problem. So we're talking about what I think is a kind of deception here, a deception.
You're saying that So you're saying that this plan, this tax plan that the president is talking about as part of an agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats these days is the beginning of the end for Social Security.
I'm saying it's setting up an attack on Social Security because it's depriving the budget of money at a crucial moment, and it's set up in a way to make it obvious to everyone that the only solution to the problem now is to get rid of Social Security, because Social Security and Medicare are the only type of programs that that need that kind of money, the $4 trillion type of money.
Are there any precedents for this in history?
Yes, there are. If we mentioned Florence the last time we were talking, the rise of what was probably the first modern capitalist economy. As I said before, the beginning is the worker creates value. The value is then appropriated by the people who own the industry that is creating this value. That industry gets concentrated. That money gets concentrated into few hands. Okay, those people are suddenly wealthy. Wealth in this instance means you got bags of gold coins lying around in your basement. Okay, at this point, the first thought that occurs to these people is, what am I going to do with this money? And the second thought occurs is, I'll get into banking. So the appropriation of this value from the laborer, depriving the laborer of a decent wage, in combination with a crooked currency, concentrates wealth in fewer and fewer hands. The crooked currency I'm talking about, Florence had a bimetal currency, gold for foreign exchange, silver for payment of wages and local commerce. The gold coin was the florin. It was if you'll excuse the expression, the gold standard for all of Europe for centuries. Okay, they created the coin. It was never debased. The silver coin, on the other hand, the penny, was mercilessly debased, and this is the way they cheated the worker. One of the main ways they cheated the worker out of his wage. So basically, they reissued debased coins. So if your wage is, 15 pennies a day, you're still getting 15 pennies, but you realize suddenly, because the coin has been debased, 15 pennies doesn't buy what it used to buy. Mm-hmm. It only buys half a loaf of bread instead of a whole loaf of bread or something like that. That's the type of crooked deal that they were subjecting the workers to. And the net result was basically the workers stopped reproducing. And when the workers stopped reproducing, in other words, having those families take their place, they killed the engine that created the money in the first place. Because, as I said before, money is sterile. The only thing that creates value is human labor applied with capital. I'm not denying that capital plays a role, but the only thing that creates value out of money is human labor.
Well,
this is the whole purpose of the myth of King Midas. Remember King Midas?
King Midas, or Croesus. Was it Croesus?
No, I'm talking about King Midas. He had the Midas touch. The Midas touch is basically he turned everything into gold. Well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Don't you wish you could turn everything into gold?
Well, sure, you'd be rich.
Yeah.
If you don't spend it.
The only problem is when you try to eat something, right?
Well, I suppose so.
You pick up the food, that big steak that you were ready to eat, suddenly the steak turned to gold.
Well, there you go. Well, you have somebody feed you. Now, see, that right there would be a great
system
right there.
As soon as it touches your mouth, it turns to gold.
Oh, I'm getting all these negative vibes from you. Now, listen, I got to ask you a question here. Now,
wait
a lot of people.
Wait a minute. Let me press the issue here. That means the purpose, the moral of this story is that gold is not the source of value. Human labor is the source of value that gets stored in money, but you're confusing cause and effect here. And if that's the case with King Midas, it's the case with Florence. People were starving to death when there were bags of money in the basement. That's the moral of that story. Go ahead.
Well, we're going to have to take a break now. When we get back, we're going to hear more about labor. I tell you what, if you're just tuning in and you're listening to this, you're going to hear a lot of emphasis on labor here. Going to start to think that Dr. E. Michael Jones might be a socialist here. So we're going to get back and talk about this when we get back. This is Culture Wars Radio. I'm your host, David Wemhoff. We'll see you right after the break. This is Culture Wars Radio, and we're back. We've been talking with Dr. E. Michael Jones regarding labor and capital and the interplay. And before we took the break, we were talking about how important labor is. And I tell you, I'm starting to see red flags waving outside. Isn't this socialism, what you're talking about?
No, this is not socialism. I am not a socialist. Socialism is a reaction to communism. A reaction to capitalism, and I'm going back before there was such a thing in an earlier period. The type of thing I'm articulating is just basic economic principles. It's got nothing to do with socialism. So I'm pre-socialist, if I'm anything.
You're pre-socialist.
But what I'm trying to say here is that labor is the source of value. Okay?
Well, aren't the bankers given labor?
Pardon me?
Aren't the bankers given labor with their work that they're doing?
That's right.
Helping with that interest?
Even they have to do some work, but they're blinded by gold, okay? And lots of people get blinded by gold or blinded by money, and to the point where they think that they don't need labor. All they need is put those two gold pieces in a drawer together, and the gold pieces will copulate, and it will come up with more money. That's known as usury. So the trajectory I'm talking about is once the people have enough money to start a bank, they immediately get involved in usury. That's the story of Florence. That's the story of the development of capitalism. And so you lend out the money, and you expect that money to copulate and come back to you. And the first loan comes back. I'm talking about now in Florence lending to princes who need money for fighting wars mostly and luxury items. So you lend it to the prince, and he pays you back, and then everything seems great, and then you lend him more money, and maybe he doesn't pay you completely back, but he says, my credit's good, lend me more money, and so you keep lending, and finally the prince defaults on his debt. That's what always happened throughout the Middle Ages, and then the bank goes bust, and that's the end of the story, and then all over again.
Are you saying that the United States has the government has been borrowing all of this money for luxury items and for wars, and so
well, certainly for wars, that's where we are right now. We're stuck with a big bill for a war that we had to borrow money to pay for.
Yeah, but isn't the biggest expense the social services? Isn't that the biggest thing?
No, it's war. It's war, and it depends on. And I'm not saying that there aren't areas to be cut. As I said before, I think that Medicare is something that needs to be cut. But you have to understand that wages, when it comes to the economy, wages are not an expense. And I'm talking about pension as deferred wages. I mean, basically, it's wage that was deferred and something that is owed to you. It's not something that's a gift, because that goes right back into the economy, whereas in the other instance, it's destroyed. It's destroyed and the money doesn't come back. That's what happened to the prince when they lent to the princes. They realized that the money's not coming back. That happened after Cosimo died. His son Piero the Gouty was his name. The Medici family suffered from gout. It was their big problem. Anyway,
terrible.
He's suffering from gout. He becomes the head of the bank, and he decides to see how things are looking, and things are looking terrible. The balance of exchange is awful, and so he decides to call in loans. And what he realizes is he can't get the money back. The money is lost. Okay, it's gone. It's never coming back. And what he does is precipitate a recession, because the people he calls the money in from can't pay, and so they go bankrupt. There's all these bankruptcies that followed. Now, Piero died. It wasn't there long. He died shortly after he became head of the bank, and he was replaced by probably the most famous Medici, Lorenzo, otherwise known as Lorenzo the Magnificent.
Yeah, I think we've all heard of him.
Yeah.
What did he do? How did he arrest this thing? I mean, it's obvious decline. It's a recession. So I guess Lorenzo is the equivalent of Obama right now, right?
Well,
so
yeah.
What did he do?
The bill came due. The bill came due when finally Lorenzo shows up. He knows the situation. The situation is hopeless. Lorenzo never made the slightest pretense of being a banker. He was a wheeler. He was a dealer. He was a diplomat. He was a prince. He was the archetypal example of the Renaissance prince. And so what he did, he found the solution. It's very simple. The simple solution to this problem, it's called looting. Looting. Yeah, looting.
Well, when you say that, I think of these tribes running across through the city with torches, burning stuff. He didn't do that.
No, he didn't. He was more sophisticated than that. That had gone out of fashion about 1,000 years before what we're talking about. Those were the Germanic tribes that looted the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was the entity that looted all those countries all over the Mediterranean basin. So looting.
Okay, how did they loot?
The Romans?
Yeah.
The basic way. You conquer the place and carry off all the gold and silver, and you bring.
Oh, okay, all right, yeah, the old-fashioned way.
The old-fashioned way. The German barbarians, our ancestors, Dave, they did it the same way. They looted the looters, okay? And then there was this pause called the Christian era, and suddenly Lorenzo finds himself, bad debts. All the books are full of bad debts. Well, what does that remind you of? That's the situation we're in right now. So what does he do? He decides he's going to make up the shortfall by looting, number one, the state treasury, and number two, his nephew's pension. Nephew's pension. What?
Pension fund or pension. So how does he
the trust fund of his nephews, which was equivalent to a pension.
Well, how does he loot it? What does he do? What does he do with the money?
Takes it out of the treasury and spends it on other things. The same thing with his nephew's trust fund. It was just stealing money.
Okay,
stealing money to keep this thing going.
Okay, so he took money out of the state treasury to pay private people?
Yeah. Pay off what he was doing. I mean, first of all, it's a little bit different because the Medici never had a public office. It was just, in a sense, what the Florentine Republic was like. It was different than ours.
No,
but I mean, in order to keep this thing going, he's got expenses. He can't pay his expenses because those debts are all bad. That money's never coming back. So he starts looting the treasury and looting his nephews. And that's how he kept this thing going. Now,
okay,
that's half the story. The other half of the story is how do you keep people from knowing that that's what you're doing? And that was a combination of crisis capitalism. Never let a crisis go to waste is what Rahm Emanuel said.
Never waste a good crisis.
Yeah. So the crisis in this instance was the Pazzi conspiracy, where there was an assassination attempt. He used that to assume dictatorial power over Florence. Everyone knew he was a dictator, but he had the power, and there wasn't anything anyone could do about it. So it was an assassination attempt. It was their 9/11, basically. Okay, and their 9/11 allowed Lorenzo to assume dictatorial power, and once he assumed dictatorial power, he could steal whatever he wanted from the treasury, and no one was there to question him. Okay, that's half the story. The other half of the story is the fact, well, how do you keep people from thinking about this? Well, you give them what the Romans called bread and circuses.
Mm-hmm.
In other words,
how did the Florentines do it?
The Florentines, it was called the Renaissance.
Okay,
the most sophisticated version of bread and circuses probably in the history of the human race. You had people like Botticelli doing the Primavera, springtime.
Okay.
Now,
can you
what does that mean? You've famous painting. You've seen it. This is what was distracting. But anyways, there's an allegory going on here. It's basically springtime. It's full of flowers. There's flowers all over the lady's dress. There's flowers coming out of her mouth and so on and so forth. This is springtime. Well, what are the flowers? Well, Florence is Fiorentina. It's the city of flowers. So the springtime is basically springtime coming to the city of flowers. What's the springtime? It's like morning in America. It's morning in Florence. It's the return of paganism to Florence. Over in the corner, if you're facing the painting, on the left-hand side, there is a figure who looks remarkably like Lorenzo de' Medici. He's in allegorical form as Mercury. He's got the caduceus, which is commerce, symbolizes commerce, and he's stirring the clouds. He's the rainmaker who's going to bring prosperity to Florence. He's going to bring paganism. It's going to be good times.
Well, I tell you what, talking about Morning in America and Primavera, boy, I tell you what, Morning in America, that's what Ronald Reagan said about 30 years ago. Well, we've got to head off to a break. You're listening to Culture Wars Radio with Dr. E. Michael Jones. Stay tuned. Come right on back. We are back at Culture Wars Radio. I'm your host, David Wemhoff. Culture Wars Radio is sponsored by CultureWars.com or Culture Wars Magazine. The editor and publisher is Dr. E. Michael Jones, who we're talking to today. Right before the break, we were talking about Primavera, a painting about the springtime in Florence, or morning in Florence. And we heard, if you remember, Ronald Reagan, who everybody calls the great conservative, the great communicator. He spoke about a springtime in America. Dr. Jones is talking about how there's a similarity between Florence of about 700-800 years ago and the United States of America now. Mike, what was it that distracted people in America from what was going on? We didn't have a Renaissance in America.
The situations there are parallels between both situations. Okay, once you realize that the money isn't there and you start looting. This is what Lorenzo did. Somebody's got to pay the bill. Where are we going to find the money? We're going to take it out of the state treasury, and we're going to loot the pension fund. Okay, to keep people from thinking about this, you sort of flood the Republic of Florence with sexual liberation. Lorenzo reintroduced Carnival. Carnival is what we call Mardi Gras, this kind of bacchanal that gets celebrated before Lent. It became really a big deal with Lorenzo. Lorenzo was a genius. He was a great poet. He composed songs to be sung at Carnival, full of double entendres that were to get people thinking about sexual things and not thinking about other things, like economic things. He created floats. It was just like the Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Big floats that cost a lot of money. Clubs would build the floats. It was just a sense of anything goes, and that's pretty much what happened in our economy as well. Beginning in the 70s. The 70s in America was when wages stopped going up.
That's correct. I remember the studies on it. Yeah.
Wages started to decline at exactly the same time that abortion was legalized. Okay.
Well, and feminism took off, too, about that same time. I remember a book by Warren and Tiagi to that effect. That's right.
Yeah, and so there was a recent, I forget who said it recently, but it was talking about disco in this context. Disco was introduced to keep you from realizing that your wages were going down or they weren't going up. This is the classic form of distraction, the classic way of keeping people befuddled and not understanding what's going on. It's based on a very sound principle, and the principle is basically that lust makes you blind. So St. Thomas Aquinas said that in the Middle Ages. I'm sure all the people in Florence knew that because they were conversant with Thomistic principles. So if you want blind people, promote lust.
Yeah.
It's that simple. Okay. And that's what happened then, and that's what happened now. And what we're seeing here is, in a sense, a deliberate misdirection, directing people away from what's really, really happening here. In a sense, we have a lust-saturated society. We have pornography available on everybody's computer, and there's nothing that this society is going to do to rein it in. It's just never going to happen because people who control it. Pardon me?
It's constitutionally protected.
That's what they say. I think it's preposterous. There was a time when it wasn't, but that's what they're telling people now. The crucial turning point in modern history was the Clinton administration.
Now, how's that? Explain that.
Well, that was right when the computers started to come on the scene, and as soon as computers and the internet started coming on the scene, the computer became the next vehicle for pornography. Pornography is always a technological phenomenon. And here was a new technology, so it was a new vehicle for delivering pornography. At this point, the law should step in and regulate. It wouldn't have been difficult to do this. They debated this thing in Congress. It came down to something called the Communications Decency Act. Mm-hmm. And at this point, Hollywood unleashed a barrage of pro-pornography films and books. If you remember Boogie Nights.
I remember that. That was about the mid-1990s, rather.
Pro-pornography, Hollywood pulling out the stops to defend pornography because Hollywood has an $8 billion pornography industry. It's probably higher than that now, but I mean, that was the figure that was bandied about then. The other was The People versus Larry Flint, another high-priced Hollywood piece of pornography propaganda. And so the result was that the Clinton administration basically took a pass, and now pornography is part of everyone's life. The fact that the rich and the powerful promoted this or allowed this to happen, there's a purpose to this. It's to keep us blind, and it's basically to keep us distracted so that we don't know that Lorenzo is looting the pension fund. That's the purpose of of pornography. That is the purpose of sexual liberation, including the latest form, which is basically promotion of homosexuality as the ideal form of behavior. It's all to distract us from the economic shenanigans that are going on behind the scenes, the type of misdirection that we're being subjected to now by the capitalist think tanks.
Well, you know, as we're talking here, the headlines are blaring across the world that Julian Assange has been arrested, detained without bail in the United Kingdom because he had sex with a couple of women, either without condoms or with a torn condom. Is this part of the misdirection, do you think?
I think it is. This is the way it comes down. The sexual liberation. You encourage people to engage in this type of activity. I'm sure the circles that he travels in, no one thinks that this is a big deal. But then once it happens, then you come down on the guy like a ton of bricks because he didn't use a condom or he didn't say good night or call her the next morning. The crime in Sweden is known as sex by surprise. We mentioned this before.
That's right.
Okay, but all of what we're talking about here is diverting everyone's attention from the fact that the pension fund's about to be looted. This is what happened then. This is what's happening now. They've run up a huge debt because of this wretched war in the Middle East, and now who's going to pay for it? Well, the capitalist answer to every problem is looting.
Well, it
make
sounds
someone
like,
else pay for it.
It sounds like what it is in a lot of ways is that it's public pain and private gain in these capitalist countries.
Capitalism for the poor people and socialism for the rich people. That's what it is.
Well, you mean capitalism for the rich people?
I mean risk for the poor people and no risk for the big people. The government bails out rich people, and the poor people get their houses foreclosed on them.
Well, you know, it's interesting because when Reagan came in 1980, he said it was morning in America, and he began one of the biggest military buildups in history.
That was as I said, look, princes needed money because they had to fight wars. Nothing has changed in this regard. Yeah. And so he needed to borrow money to fight war. And so basically what he did was he sold the working man down the river in order to finance his wars.
And who benefits from the wars?
The people who are making what's called the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
You've heard about that.
Well, President Eisenhower warned us about that.
That's right. And basically what happened here is that Reagan, in exchange for the Japanese buying the debt, which allowed him to fund his wars, the Japanese were allowed into the American car market, and that hurt Detroit. Detroit has been suffering ever since.
But Detroit has got a bright side to it. We're going to find out a little bit more about that and some other things on the other side of the break here. You are listening to Culture Wars Radio with Dr. E. Michael Jones. I'm your host, David Wemhoff. We'll see you in just a second. This is Culture Wars Radio, and we are back with Dr. E. Michael Jones, publisher and editor of Culture Wars magazine. Before the break, we were talking about the looting of the U.S. Treasury, I guess it is, and by Reagan on to fund a number of different wars that benefit the industrial military complex. And we were talking about how during the 1980s, the government of Reagan allowed the Japanese cars into the U.S. market. Detroit took a hit. Ford was one of those companies that took a hit. But you know what? When all the other companies were calling for bailouts in the last couple of years, Ford stood firm and said, we don't want any government money. Now, as I recall, Henry Ford refused to go public with Ford Motor Company, and Henry Ford had a very interesting concept on how one should treat their workers, didn't he? What was that concept?
Pay them $5 a day. In other words, pay more than the going rate for labor in Detroit. So he automatically got the best workers. They flocked to Ford. He automatically put money in the pockets of those workers who then could afford the product that they were producing. So they could buy more and more people could buy cars, and as a result the price came down, and that meant more and more people could buy cars after that. So it was like what you call a virtuous cycle. And the key to this virtuous cycle was high wages. You can't have prosperity in a country without high wages. Low wages destroy the economy. That's the whole point of this thing. And this is the whole problem, what we're talking about with Social Security, because Social Security is, in a sense, deferred wages. So wages go directly into the economy. Wages are an asset that propels the economy along. If you cut the wages, you're going to destroy the economy. Now, the Fed is now being run by a guy named Bernanke, who is an expert on the Great Depression, and there's all sorts of stories about the Great Depression, what caused it or what made it worse. Okay. And the classic story is the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, raising tariffs and raising taxes in a recession. This is bad, so we have to ban tariffs and we have to ban taxes. The thing that's missing, there's something dubious about that, but anyway, it's only half the story. What happened also is that wages plummeted by 30% during this period of time. I think it was 29 to 31, I think. Something like that. Plummeted by 30%, and as a result, demand got cut off and the economy was strangled. This is always the danger with capitalism. It's always concentrating wealth into fewer and fewer hands, which means that wages go down, and the wages go down, the economy strangles. And the economy can strangle even if there are lots of money there. At a certain point in Florence, the oligarchic families had so much money they didn't know what to do with it, okay? Right. So they started building palaces. Right. So there was a Palazzo Medici, and that cost, I think the figure was 2,000 florins. So multiply 2,000 times whatever the cost, an ounce of gold is now, what is it, 1,300, something like that.
Oh, something outrageous, yeah.
So anyway, you get some sense of what the price was.
But a lot of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So they're competing with each other. Then the Strozzi family, which is a wealthy family, they built a palace that had cost 40,000 florins, 20 times what the Medici family cost, their palace cost.
Okay.
So he's waiting to take over his palace, and suddenly he dies. So the man who built it, it's like a story right out of the Bible, you know. Hmm. Anyway, and they go into his house to move his things into his new palace. They found 50,000 florins in bags in the basement.
Well, he's thrifty.
This is money. The country is strangling. The economy is strangling, and there's money there all over the place. But it's not doing anything.
Yeah, well, then
going into circulation.
The United States of America is going to print more money. Then that's what they'll do. The Fed will turn on the.
But the whole point of this, it doesn't matter if you print the money and it's concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. That's what happens when you print it and give it to the banks.
They just sit on the money. In fact, that's one of the criticisms. It doesn't come out. Is they're sitting on billions of dollars.
This is the difference between banks and Social Security. The government should be issuing money. The government does issue money when it pays out Social Security.
Right.
That's the difference. That money goes directly into the economy and fuels the economy. Now, we're talking about one small part of this thing. Social Security is not the economy, but it is a big part of the economy, and it is money that goes directly into the economy the way wages go in. We need to address the whole issue of wages. Social Security is the subset of a bigger issue, which is called wages, and that's been problematic in this country from the beginning.
And right now, Social Security is under attack, and what you're saying about wages being problematic in this country, you're talking about there's always been a pressure for low wages.
Right.
Yet still, this is the best economy in the world. I mean, it provides the most things to people, the most goods. Boy, you can get whatever you want in this country. So what am I missing?
You're living in the past here. We're not producing what we should be producing. We're keeping people entertained by pornography and giving them the sense that they have money by importing cheap junk from China.
Yeah, I can go out, I can buy any camera I want, any car I want, I can go watch any movie, I can eat, all these great meals. Hey, life is good.
Well, that's called bread and circuses. Huh. Because in effect what you're doing is every time you export jobs from this country, you're crippling the ability to come out, the economy's ability to come out of this recession. The difference between America and Germany now is that Germany is coming out because they did not dismantle their manufacturing base the way we have, did not cripple their manufacturing base the way we have. According to what I mentioned to you before, job exportation and this private equity, which is another leverage buyouts, which is another form of looting, which is the destruction of jobs, not the creation of jobs. So the Germans are ahead of us in that regard in their recovery because they have not plundered and looted their economy the way America has over this period of time.
So they put reins on this private equity, on private individuals trying to maximize profit at the expense of jobs, right?
Germany has never been fully on board when it comes to capitalism. Never.
Well, maybe it's time to start bombing its cities again. What do you think?
No, that's in the past. They have never been fully on board. The Germans were the heirs of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire was an implementation of Christian principle in the economy. It was Christianity that turned our German ancestors from looters into farmers, and it created a society that was built on stability rather than volatility, which is what the capitalist economy is based on. And it's never completely gone away. So the fact that BMW has producing something that the world really wants, it's expensive, but there are people all over the world that want this thing because it's kind of state-of-the-art technology. They have, because they have taken care of that industry. These cars have surpassed, I believe, I hope I don't get into trouble here, surpassed American cars in terms of their technological sophistication.
Well, that could be, but that could very well be. I don't know, but Germany is definitely weathering the economic situation now. We're getting close to the end of our time. I think this has been very enlightening, this whole discussion about economics, wages, how it's all tied together. I think that for more information, definitely you want to go to www.culturewars.com or subscribe to Culture Wars magazine, where the editor is Dr. E. Michael Jones. He is also the publisher. Dr. Jones has written a number of books over the years dealing with cultural issues, to include architecture, sexual liberation, and he is now working on a number of materials dealing with capitalism and economics. I want to encourage you to visit that site to get a subscription to Culture Wars magazine, and we want to thank you for listening today. This is Culture Wars Radio, wishing you all the best and signing off.